The ledger was wrong. Penelope Ashworth knew it the way she knew the weight of a cracked floorboard underfoot, not from examination, but from the particular resistance of a thing that did not sit right. She set down her candle on the corner of the desk, pressed her fingertip to the column of figures, and began again from the top. The great house around her was entirely silent. It was not the soft silence of sleep, but the harder silence of stone. Ashworth Park had been the ancestral seat of the Dukes of Merivale for 200 years, and it had the settled gravity of all old things. Every corridor was 16 feet wide, every doorframe was carved, the chandelier in the entrance hall contained 47 candles, and she had counted them on her second morning, because she counted everything she was uncertain about, until she was no longer uncertain. She had arrived 6 weeks ago as governess to Lord Ashworth's niece, Miss Clara Vane, aged 9. She had brought a trunk, a letter of recommendation from the Honourable Mrs. Dunmore of Wiltshire, and a competence she had never been invited to name aloud. The post was meant to be temporary, a household between positions, a name on a list. She had not expected to find herself, 43 mornings in, seated at the estate's secondary desk in the East Wing at 5:15 in the morning, with a copy of the household ledger open before her, tracing a discrepancy that had been accumulating for at least 3 years. But the ledger had been sitting in the schoolroom bookshelf when she arrived, misplaced, most likely, or stored there when the governess's post had been vacant and someone had run out of shelf space, and Penelope had opened it on her third evening out of professional habit, the same way she opened all documents placed within reach, and the error had looked back at her from the middle of page 41, like a stone dropped into still water, sending out rings. 43 mornings, and she had not yet worked out who had made the error, or whether it was error at all. She was still working it out when the door to the East Wing study opened, and she learned, in that moment, exactly how it felt to have the Duke of Merivale look at her. He did not say anything. He stood in the doorway in his shirt and waistcoat, no coat, no cravat, his dark hair uncombed, and he looked at her the way a man looks at something that does not fit any category he has prepared for, not with alarm, and not with desire, but with the particular stillness of a person who has just registered something he does not yet have words for. Penelope did not move. She had the ledger open in front of her, and her finger still resting on page 63, and she met his gaze across the room, with the straightforward attention of someone who had been caught doing nothing that required concealment. The Duke of Merivale, Lucian Ashworth, the sixth of his name, returned to his estate 2 months ago after 4 years abroad, was exactly as the household described him, tall, composed, dark-coated when properly dressed, which he was not at the moment. He had not yet spoken a direct word to Penelope in 6 weeks, which she found practical rather than rude, because a man who did not speak to the governess was a man who was not yet watching the governess, and she had preferred to work without being watched. She was no longer working without being watched. "Miss Ashworth," the Duke said, and his voice in the pre-dawn room was quiet and precise, like the first note of a composition before the rest of it decides what it will be. "May I ask what you are doing with my household ledger at 5 in the morning?" "Correcting it," said Penelope, "Your Grace." He considered that for a moment in silence. She had not come from nowhere. That was the first thing to understand about Penelope Ashworth, though almost no one had ever taken the time to understand it. She had come from Dorset, specifically from the kind of household that appears prosperous from the outside, because enormous effort has been directed, for years, toward maintaining the appearance. Her father, Mr. Gerald Ashworth, no relation to the Ashworths of Merivale, had been a decent man and a careless one, which is sometimes the most difficult combination to navigate. He had loved his daughters and underfunded his estate, and died of a fever in the autumn of 1817, leaving behind 3 daughters, a mortgaged property, and an arrangement of accounts that no one had examined closely in 8 years. Penelope had been 22. Her elder sister Charlotte was already married and settled in Bath. Her younger sister Anne was 15 and needed 2 more years of schooling at minimum. The male relation who arrived to assess the estate was their mother's cousin, Mr. Leonard Birch, a man who spoke often about duty, and who understood it to mean, specifically, the duty of women to accept what they were given without accounting for themselves. Mr. Birch declared the estate unmanageable. He proposed its sale. He offered to take Anne into his household in Gloucestershire, and did not extend the offer to Penelope, because Penelope had, at that first meeting, asked to see the creditor schedule, and noted an inaccuracy on the third page, and Mr. Birch had not forgiven her for it. She had refused to step aside. This was not drama. It was a decision she made in the library of her father's house on a Tuesday in November, with the account books spread across the reading table, and a cup of cold tea at her elbow. She looked at the estate's debts and the estate's assets and the estate's income, and she saw, the way she saw most things, what the actual situation was. The debts were real. The situation was genuinely difficult, but it was not unmanageable. Mr. Birch was proposing to sell the property because it was the path of least complication for Mr. Birch, and he was dressing that proposal in the language of inevitability. She wrote to the three principal creditors herself, identifying herself as the managing daughter of the late Mr. Ashworth, and proposing a repayment schedule. She wrote to the wool merchant who handled the estate's fleece and renegotiated the quarterly rate. She found, in the secondary account book her father had kept separately, 2 outstanding debts owed to the estate, not by the estate, that had never been recorded in the main ledger, totaling £63, and she collected them both by correspondence within 4 months. By the spring of 1818, the estate was not prosperous, but it was stable. Anne finished her schooling. The property was not sold. Mr. Birch had been furious in a quiet, structural way, the way men are furious when a woman does the thing they declared impossible and neglects to make it visible enough for them to take credit for it. Penelope had managed the estate for 3.5 years before the final mortgage was settled, and Charlotte, now in a stronger position in Bath, was able to take Anne in and provide the permanent home that Penelope could not offer her. By then there was nothing left to manage in Dorset. By then Penelope was 25, unmarried, and in possession of a skill set that the world had no official name for, and no intention of paying her what it was worth. She had written a letter to Mrs. Dunmore in Wiltshire, whom she had met once at a market in Salisbury, and who had seemed like a woman who understood practical matters. Mrs. Dunmore had recognized what she was looking at. She had employed Penelope for 2 years, not as a governess technically, but as a household secretary, with the additional duties of educating the youngest Miss Dunmore, and the arrangement had suited them both, until Mrs. Dunmore's eldest son married, and the new wife brought her own secretary. There had been another household after that, and another. Each time, Penelope arrived with her trunk and her letter, and her competence, was placed in a role that was somewhat smaller than what she actually did, and performed that role with a thoroughness that made her indispensable and invisible in equal measure. She had managed creditor negotiations from behind the title of upper housemaid. She had renegotiated a solicitor's invoice from behind the title of companion. She had audited 3 years of estate accounts from behind the title of governess. She was not bitter about the titles. A title was a mechanism. Mechanisms were how the world organized itself, and Penelope had always been more interested in understanding the mechanism than in arguing with it. She understood that a woman without property or connections was assigned a title that made her work appear small, and she understood that the work was not small, and she had decided, sometime in the Dorset Library in the winter of 1817, that she was going to do the work anyway, because the alternative was to become less than she was, and that she had ruled out completely. The moment she had almost broken, the one she did not speak of, had been in the 2nd year of the estate management, when the wool merchant had refused to negotiate with her directly, and had written instead to Mr. Birch, assuming that a man must ultimately be an authority. Mr. Birch had replied, on her behalf, accepting the original rate she had already refused. She had discovered this through a second letter from the merchant that arrived at the estate before Mr. Birch's arrangement could be finalized, and she had sat very still for a long time in the library with that letter in her hands. Then she had picked up her list, found the name of a second wool merchant in the county, and written to him instead. The new rate was 4 shillings per stone better than the one Mr. Birch had accepted. She had not told Mr. Birch about the merchant she had found. She had simply applied the savings to the creditor repayment schedule, advanced the timeline by 6 months, and continued. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like rescue. Lucian Ashworth had not expected to return to Merivale Park. He had gone abroad in the autumn of 1820, with the specific intention of remaining absent long enough that the estate's management, and the expectations of the estate's management, might be sufficiently reorganized in his absence that he could return to something other than what he had left. What he had left was a house full of the specific silence that follows a death that no one has been permitted to grieve properly, because the death was a woman's, and the house had to go on. His mother had died in the spring of 1820, and she had died in the way that strong, competent women sometimes died in houses that had never officially acknowledged how much they held up. She had been ill for 2 years before anyone in the household was told. She had managed the estate, the correspondence, the tenants, the household accounts, and the Duke's political calendar from her morning room, while becoming progressively more unwell, and when she finally could not continue, she had been 3 months from death, and the estate had been, it turned out, entirely dependent on knowledge that lived only in her head. Lucian had been 28 when she died. He was the 6th Duke of Merivale, and he had been educated for it, groomed for it, positioned for it, and he had stood in his mother's morning room in May of 1820 and looked at her accounts and understood, for the first time clearly, how much she had done without being seen to do it. He had gone abroad because he did not know what to do with that understanding. He had returned because the estate required a duke, and he was the duke, and he was not, in the final accounting, a man who abandoned his responsibilities simply because he found them painful. He had arrived at Merivale in September, and the house had assembled itself to receive him. The housekeeper, the head of staff, the solicitor, the estate manager, and he had moved through it all with the contained efficiency of a man completing an obligation. He had reviewed the accounts. He had met with the tenants. He had approved the winter household budget. He had engaged, at the suggestion of his solicitor, a governess for his niece Clara, who was 9, and who had come to live at Merivale 6 months ago, when her parents had gone to India, and who needed, everyone agreed, a steadying influence and some instruction in mathematics and French. He had not, at any point in this sequence of decisions, paid specific attention to the governess herself. She was a woman in a gray dress who appeared at the edges of household events, who managed Clara with quiet competence, who did not raise her voice, and who, when he had passed her in the corridor on his second week back, had stepped aside and given him a brief, formal nod without any of the particular performance of deference that most of the household offered. He had noticed that. He had not yet understood what he had noticed. What had changed things was the music. Merivale had a music room that had not been opened in 4 years. His mother had played. After her death, the room had been shut and remained so. He had walked past it every day since his return without pausing. On the 19th of October, at 7 in the evening, he had heard something coming from behind the closed door. He had stopped in the corridor. The music was not his mother's. He knew her favorites by heart, and this was not any of them. It was something he didn't recognize, something careful and precisely structured, not showy, not sentimental, the kind of playing that meant the person at the piano was thinking rather than performing. It was playing that sounded like intelligence, and it stopped him the way very few things stopped him anymore. He had stood outside that door for 20 minutes. He had not opened it. The following evening, at the same hour, he had stood there for 30 minutes. On the third evening, he had asked his housekeeper, Mrs. Laura Finch, who was playing the piano in the music room. "Miss Ashworth, Your Grace," Mrs. Finch had said, in the tone of someone confirming a thing that should have been obvious. "The governess. She plays of an evening when Miss Clara is in bed. I hope it has not been a disturbance." It had been the opposite of a disturbance. He had stood in the corridor and listened to someone play the way his mother used to think. Organized, precise, unhurried, attending to every part of the structure, and he had felt something that was not comfort exactly but was shaped like the memory of it. He had said nothing to Mrs. Finch about what he had heard. He had gone back to his study and retrieved the file his solicitor had compiled on the governess when she was engaged. The letter from Mrs. Dunmore was effusive in a controlled way, the best kind, the kind that meant the recommendation was genuine rather than kind. The record of her previous posts was longer than he had expected, 4 households in 5 years, each position slightly below what the description of her actual duties suggested she ought to have been employed as. He had put the file away and thought about that for a long time. And then, 9 days later, he had walked into the East Wing study at 5 in the morning because he had not slept and was heading for the kitchen to find something cold to drink, and he had found Penelope Ashworth at his secondary desk with his household ledger open in front of her, correcting it. Correcting it, she had said, and met his gaze without flinching. He pulled out the chair across the desk from her and sat down. It was a discourteous hour for formality, and he had left his coat upstairs. "Show me," he said. She had not hesitated. She had turned the ledger and set it between them, and she had begun from page 41, where the discrepancy originated. It was not a single error. It was a pattern, a systematic underreporting of the quarterly timber receipts from the northern woodland, begun approximately 3 years ago, applied across 12 consecutive quarters, producing a cumulative shortfall in the recorded accounts of £147. The money appeared to have been drawn against a maintenance line item that did not correspond to any maintenance work Penelope had found in the estate's physical records. She told him all of this in approximately 8 minutes, speaking quietly and precisely, pointing to each figure as she named it. She had cross-referenced the timber accounts with 3 other ledgers she had found in the same section of the bookshelf. She had compiled a summary page in her own hand, which she produced from between the ledger's back pages. He read her summary page. It was organized with the specificity of a legal instrument. Every figure had its source notation. Every conclusion had the figures that supported it. "When did you find this?" he said. 6 weeks ago, Your Grace. I've spent the time verifying it." He looked at her across the desk. The candlelight was insufficient for a full accounting of her expression, but what he could read was the expression of someone who had brought everything she had to a task and expected, from long experience, to be thanked for it by being told she had overstepped. He did not thank her in a way that resembled that. "Who else has seen this?" he asked. "No one. My estate manager, Mr. Hollis. He has had access to the ledger for 3 years," she said. "The pattern begins 3 years ago. I would not have shown it to him before showing it to you." Lucian looked at the summary page again. He looked at it with the attention it deserved. "Miss Ashworth," he said, "what was your previous post?" "Secretary to the household of Mr. James Vernon of Devonshire." "Before that?" "Companion and household manager to Lady Sefton Ward of Oxfordshire. Before that, household secretary to Mrs. Dunmore of Wiltshire." She paused. "I have been a governess, properly speaking, for 6 weeks." He said nothing. He set down her summary page and looked at her with the precise attention he gave to things he intended to understand completely. "I will address the matter with the solicitor," he said, "not with Hollis. I would ask you to say nothing in the meantime." "Of course," she said, "and Miss Ashworth." He stood, and the candle between them threw the shadow of him long across the study wall. "You will tell me if you find anything else." It was not a question. She recognized the form of it, the form of a man who had just identified something he intended to pay attention to, and was making a structural adjustment accordingly. She picked up her candle and returned to the ledger and did not allow herself to think about what his undone cravat would look like if he had been wearing one. The weeks that followed had a different quality than the 6 before them. She could not have defined the difference precisely in a way that would satisfy an observer. The house was the same. Clara's lessons continued. The gray dress was the same gray dress. But something in the machinery of her daily life had shifted by 1 degree, the way a door shifts on a good hinge, so that it moves differently without appearing to have moved at all. The Duke, who had previously been a tall absence in the upper corridors, began to appear at smaller hours. He was there at breakfast, not eating, but standing at the window of the morning room with a cup of coffee, when she brought Clara down. He appeared in the corridor outside the schoolroom on a Tuesday at 11, which was not a corridor he had any particular reason to be in, and when she came out to retrieve a book she had left on the hall table, he said, without preamble, "I've engaged an independent auditor for the Northern accounts. He arrives Thursday." She had said, "I'll have the supplementary figures ready by Wednesday evening," and he had nodded once and gone. On Thursday evening, after the auditor had spent the day with the estate solicitor and the timber records, Lucian came to the schoolroom door when Clara was already in bed. He knocked, which he had not done before. "The auditor's preliminary finding supports your analysis," he said. "Hollis has been released. I wanted you to know." Penelope set down the pen she was marking with. "Thank you for telling me." He looked at the schoolroom, at the slates and the atlases and the small painted globe on the shelf, and the French conjugation list she had pinned to the wall. He looked at it as a man looks at a room he has not seen before, in a house he thought he knew thoroughly. "You are not only a governess," he said. "I am whatever is useful," said Penelope. He considered that for a moment. "That was not what I meant." She knew what he meant. She was not going to make it easier for him by pretending she did not. "Clara has made real progress with her French," she said, which was a redirection but also true. "She has a facility for language that she hasn't been encouraged. Her previous instruction focused on music. Her mother was musical," he said. And then, in a different register, quieter, "My mother was musical." The shift was small enough that a person not paying attention would not have caught it. Penelope caught it. She recognized it as something he had not intended to say, or had intended only partially, and she did not pursue it. She had the particular restraint of someone who had learned that the most important things people said were said sideways, and required space rather than response. She said, "Clara told me she heard the music room described but has never been inside it." A pause. "No, it has been closed. She is curious about it. Children her age often are, about the things that are forbidden by the condition of being a child." She paused. "I do not play for an audience, as a rule. But if the room were opened, I would not mind teaching her the basics of the keyboard." It was not an offer about the room. They both understood that. He said, "I will have it unlocked." The music room was opened on a Friday morning. Mrs. Finch arranged the windows and had the housemaid dust the keys and remove the Holland covers from the furniture. And when Penelope arrived with Clara, she found a room that was clearly, specifically, the room of a woman who had thought carefully about beauty and ordered it around herself with precision. The bookshelves held scores and bound volumes of music theory. There was a small writing desk in the corner where someone had set a sealed inkwell that had never been moved. On the wall above the piano, framed in plain wood, was a single sheet of manuscript paper, in a hand Penelope did not recognize. Clara ran immediately to the piano bench and placed her hands on the keys without pressing them, because she had been raised with enough manners to wait. Penelope stood at the manuscript on the wall for a moment and read it. A composition, partial, only 2 pages, the notation precise and unhurried. The initials in the corner were M.A. Margaret Ashworth. She pressed one hand briefly against the wall beside the frame. Then she turned and went to the piano bench and began Clara's first lesson. The hardest thing that happened in those weeks was not the estate manager's dismissal, though that had rattled the household for a fortnight. It was not the arrival of Lady Cecilia Vance. Lady Cecilia arrived in the 2nd week of November with her mother, and her luggage, and her particular manner of entering a room, which was the manner of someone accustomed to having rooms organized around their arrival. She was 25, exactly correct in every visible way, with dark hair arranged by someone who knew their business and a social education that had prepared her to be a duchess in the same way that a well-built bridge prepares to be used by considerable weight, entirely and without visible effort. She had been, Penelope understood from the household's quiet commentary, the expected candidate, the name that had been placed beside the Merivale dukedom by the families that organized such things, the way they organized weather predictions, with confidence in the general pattern, if not the specific date. That the Duke had not yet formalized anything was understood to be temporary. That he had returned from abroad was understood to be the signal. Lady Cecilia had come to ensure the signal was correctly read. She sat at the dinner table on her first evening in the house, and she was everything Penelope was not, titled, connected, beautifully dressed, certain of her right to be at the center of a room, and she was correct about all of it, by the exact measures that the world Penelope lived in endorsed. She noticed Penelope twice on that first evening. The first time was when Penelope passed the drawing-room door with a book for Clara, and Lady Cecilia's glance traveled over her with the complete absence of distinction that a woman of Lady Cecilia's breeding applied to servants and near-servants. The second time was at the supper table the following evening, when Lady Cecilia's mother, having exhausted the subjects of the London season and the Merivale grounds, said to the room at large, "And who is the girl managing the little Vane child? She seems quite adequate." "Miss Ashworth," said Mrs. Finch, who had been invited to sit at the family table because Merivale was informal in that way. "She is an excellent governess." Lady Cecilia's gaze moved to Penelope. "Are you comfortable here, Miss Ashworth?" "Very, thank you," said Penelope. "And have you been in the position long?" "6 weeks." "How do you find the country after the city? I imagine it is rather quiet for a young woman of your—" She selected the word with the delicacy of a woman picking a pin from a cushion. "Energies." The table attended to this. Penelope recognized the form of it. The words were correct on the surface, but what was being said was that Penelope was young and out of her depth in a house of this scale, and that Lady Cecilia was aware of this without finding it worth much attention. Penelope set down her fork. "I find I have more than enough to occupy me," she said. "The estate accounts required some attention when I arrived, and I've been working through them. Mathematics is absorbing in any landscape." A pause. Lady Cecilia's mother smiled in the way that means one has not fully processed what was just said. It was Lucian who spoke next. He had been watching the exchange from his end of the table with the particular stillness he applied to things he was in the process of understanding. "Miss Ashworth assisted in identifying a significant irregularity in the northern accounts," he said. "Her analysis was precise enough that the estate solicitor asked whether she had any formal training in accountancy." The table reformed itself around this information. Lady Cecilia said, after a moment, "How useful," and the words meant the opposite of what they said, but she said nothing further, and the conversation moved on, and Penelope had learned everything she needed to know about what the following weeks would contain. She was right. The household had its rhythms, and Lady Cecilia moved through them with the confidence of a woman who has been taught that confidence is the same as permission. She sat with Lucian at every formal occasion, and she managed it well. She was not, Penelope thought, with a fairness she tried to maintain, even when it cost something, a cruel woman or a stupid one. She was a woman who had been prepared for a specific role by a system that believed in its own logic, and she performed it without apology because she had not been given reason to question it. The difficulty was in the library. Penelope used the library in the evenings, after Clara was in bed and before the household retired, because it was where the estate records were kept, and because no one else used it at that hour. It was a room she had come to think of as a working room, her working room, in the temporary way that any room becomes one's own when one occupies it consistently enough. Lucian began using it at the same hour. The first time, she had been certain it was coincidence. She had her ledger and her pen, and she had collected herself into the far corner of the room, without making anything of it. He had taken a book from the third shelf, and read for approximately 40 minutes, and left. The second evening, he had taken a different book and stayed for an hour and a half. On the third evening, he had looked up from whatever he was reading and said, without preamble, "What do you make of the tenant farms on the eastern boundary?" She had looked up from her own work. "They are underperforming relative to the western boundary farms by approximately 15%, but the differential is in the drainage. The eastern fields have had a persistent drainage problem that the previous estate manager attributed to clay subsoil. I think he was correct about the cause, and wrong about the remedy. The western farms rerouted surface water 30 years ago. I found the surveyor's report. A similar approach on the eastern side would likely recover most of the differential inside 5 years." He had looked at her for a long moment. "How did you find a surveyor's report from 30 years ago?" "It was filed with the 1791 accounts. I've been working through the archive in order." He looked at the stack of records she had accumulated beside her chair. He looked at the annotated pages she had inserted at intervals throughout. He looked at her. "Miss Ashworth," he said, "you are managing my estate." "I am organizing your records," she said. "The management decisions are yours." "That is a precise distinction. I try to be precise." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your cravat. That is to say," he stopped. "You're not wearing a cravat," Penelope said. "You abandoned it 3 evenings ago." Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile, but was the motion that precedes one. I was going to ask whether you always correct what you find in front of you. Only when it wants correcting, she said, which was the most personal thing she had said to him, and she picked up her pen and returned to the drainage figures to prevent herself from examining the remark too closely. He did not leave for another 2 hours. The mornings she worked through the archive had taken on a particular quality, not the quality of the early dawn sessions when she had been alone, but something different, because now there was often a point at which she heard his study door open and close, and knew, from the sound of his footfall in the corridor, whether he was going out or coming in. She had learned the vocabulary of his movement through the house the way one learns a new language, slowly, then suddenly, until the meaning was available without effort. On a morning in the 3rd week of November, she found the letter. It was in the 1818 correspondence file, which she had been working through as part of the archive organization, and it was from the late Duchess, his mother, to the estate solicitor. It concerned the music room, specifically the manuscript score on the wall, which the Duchess had composed herself and wished, in the letter, to have preserved as part of the estate's permanent record rather than her personal effects, so that it might remain in the house after her. Penelope read the letter twice. She read it with the attention she gave to things that cost someone something to write. Then she took the letter to Lucian's study and knocked. He was at his desk when she entered, and he stood. He always stood when she entered, which was a courtesy he had not performed initially, and which she had registered without making anything of it. She set the letter on his desk and said, "This was in the 1818 correspondence file. I thought you should have it." He picked it up and read it. His face was still in the way that his face was always still, but there was something in the stillness that was different from his habitual composure, something that was weight rather than control. "She wanted it to stay," he said. "She did." He held the letter for a long moment. "She used to play when she thought no one was listening," he said. "She was wrong about that. I used to stand in the corridor." Penelope said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying that the room wasn't already saying for her. After a moment, she said, "The score on the wall is 2 pages. The letter mentions there is a 3rd page, which she sent to the solicitor separately. If you want it returned, I believe the solicitor's archive." "Yes," he said, "I do, thank you." He looked at the letter once more. Then he looked at her. "Miss Ashworth, would you?" He stopped. He was not a man who left sentences unfinished, and the incomplete one sat between them like a door standing open in a corridor. "Play it," she said. "If that is what you're asking. When I have the 3rd page, yes, I will play all of it." He said, "That is what I was asking." She went back to the archive and did not think about how his voice had sounded when he said it. The investors came in the 1st week of December. This was not unexpected. Lucian had mentioned, in the library on a Thursday, that the Merivale estate held a series of agricultural investment agreements with 3 London partnerships, agreements that were reviewed annually, and had been under particular scrutiny since the dismissal of the estate manager. What was unexpected was that the investors, upon arriving, brought with them a representative of the firm that had employed Hollis before Lucian had engaged him, a man named Mr. Whitmore, who was silver-haired and precise, and who carried with him the particular authority of someone who has been managing money longer than most people have been alive. He also brought, which Penelope recognized within 20 minutes of his arrival, the assumption that the account irregularities Hollis had created were less the act of a dishonest employee and more the consequence of inadequate oversight on the part of the estate's principal management, which was to say, on the part of Lucian. She had the full account of this from Mrs. Finch, who had ears in every room of the house and a disposition toward Penelope that had warmed steadily from their first week together into something that looked considerably like protective loyalty. "He's suggesting," Mrs. Finch told her in the kitchen on the Tuesday evening, "that the Duke ought to have had a qualified estate manager doing the oversight from the start, rather than relying on whoever found the accounts by accident in the bookshelf." "He didn't say that precisely." "Close enough," said Mrs. Finch, "and Mr. Whitmore is bringing a replacement manager from his own firm." Penelope set down her tea. "What are the investment agreements tied to?" "Specifically, the Northern Woodlands," said Mrs. Finch, "and the Eastern Boundary Farms." Penelope went back to the archive. She worked through the night, or most of it. She had the investment agreements from the solicitor's file. Lucian had given her access to the complete estate archive 3 weeks ago, which had been an act of trust so concrete and so uncommented upon that she had simply accepted it and begun organizing. And she read them through with the attention she gave to instruments that had legal weight. They were 12-year agreements, entered in 1815. They carried specific performance clauses. If the estate's agricultural yield fell below a threshold in any 3 consecutive years, the investment partners had the right to appoint their own management representative. Yield figures for 1818, 1819, and 1820 were in the accounts. She pulled them. She checked them against the timber receipts before and after Hollis's systematic underreporting began. The yield had fallen below the threshold in all 3 of those years. But the shortfall was in the reported figures, which Hollis had manipulated, not in the actual output. The actual yield, reconstructed from the production records she had found in the archive, had exceeded the threshold in all 3 years. She had the evidence. She needed it organized. She worked until 4:15 in the morning and produced a document of 11 pages with every source figure cited, every reconstruction calculation shown, and a summary page at the front in the form the solicitor would need in order to present it. At 4:30, she heard Lucian's study door open. He found her in the archive room, which was what the East Wing study had effectively become, with 11 pages spread across the desk, and a candle that had burned to within 2 inches of its base. He looked at the pages. He looked at her. He did not ask what she had found. He came to the desk and stood beside her, and read the summary page and then, without speaking, turned to the first full page and read that too. He stood close enough that she could have placed her hand on his arm without extending it far. She did not. He read to the end. He looked at the summary again. The actual yield never fell below threshold, he said. No, the reported yield did, but that was Hollis's manipulation. The production figures are here. She pointed to the relevant column. The investor's management clause was never validly triggered. He straightened. He stood very still in the way he went still when he was making a decision, rather than considering one. The meeting is tomorrow at 10, he said. I know. The document is ready for the solicitor. He can present it. I would suggest he receive it tonight. He will want time to read it before the morning. Lucian looked at her with the specific attention she had come to recognize. The attention that was not about her appearance or her position or her dress, but about what she actually was. Miss Ashworth, he said, and then he stopped in the same way he had stopped before, with the sentence only begun. She waited. I want you in the room tomorrow, he said. Not presenting, not explaining yourself to men who ought to know better, simply there. If there is a question about the figures that you have prepared, I want the person who prepared them to be present to answer it. She said, that is not how these meetings are typically conducted. No, he said, it is not. He looked at her steadily. Will you be there? She had managed estate accounts from behind the title of housemaid. She had renegotiated creditor schedules under the name of companion. She had drafted the legal foundation of a defense against a fraudulent management claim from behind the title of Governess, in a candlelit archive room, alone, and no one had asked her to. She said yes. He took the 11 pages, retrieved his coat from the chair where he had left it, and went to find the solicitor. She pressed one hand briefly against the desk, and then went upstairs to sleep for 3 hours before breakfast. The meeting was held in the estate's formal drawing room, which had enough chairs for all 3 investment partners, and Mr. Whitmore and the solicitor, Mr. Edward Graves, who had been the estate's senior legal advisor for 20 years, and who, upon reading Penelope's 11 pages at midnight, had written a note in the margin of the summary page that said only, thorough. He had underlined it. Lady Cecilia's mother had arranged a reason to be in the morning room that shared a wall with the drawing room, which Penelope noted without commenting on. Lady Cecilia herself was at breakfast with Clara, because Penelope had asked her, with the kind of directness that left no ambiguity, to keep Clara occupied until the meeting concluded. Lady Cecilia had agreed in the manner of someone who understood, for the first time, that the governess was operating in more than one room simultaneously. Penelope took a chair against the far wall, behind the solicitor. She had brought a copy of the 11 pages and a pen. She was wearing the gray dress. Mr. Whitmore opened. He was good at it. He had the voice of someone who had spent decades in rooms where his conclusions were accepted before he finished speaking, and he moved through the argument with the efficiency of a man who had already decided the outcome. The estate had been subject to management failures. The yield figures for 1818 through 1820 had fallen below the threshold defined in the partnership agreements. The investment partners had, therefore, the contractual right to appoint a management representative. He proposed Mr. Renwick, of his own firm, who had extensive experience with agricultural estates. He presented the yield figures. They were Hollis's figures, the manipulated ones. Mr. Graves waited until Mr. Whitmore had finished. Then he set Penelope's 11 pages on the table, turned to the first full page, and began. He presented the reconstruction methodically, citing each source document by its archive reference. He presented the actual production records against the reported figures. He demonstrated, column by column, that the reported shortfall had been entirely the product of Hollis's systematic falsification. He presented the corrected yield calculations for all 3 years. He noted that the estate's actual output had not merely met the threshold, but had exceeded it by margins of between 8 and 14%. The room was quiet in a particular way during this presentation. Penelope had sat through enough rooms like this one to know the quality of that quiet. It was the quiet of men recalibrating, without showing that they were doing so. Mr. Whitmore, to his credit, did not bluster. He asked for a brief adjournment to review the source documents. The solicitor produced them, all of them, organized in the sequence Penelope had specified, with the archive references marked. Lucian sat at the head of the table throughout all of this, and he was extraordinarily still, the stillness of a man who has nothing to prove, because the proof is already on the table. During the adjournment, Mr. Whitmore turned to Lucian and said, "Where did this analysis originate?" Lucian turned and looked at Penelope. "Miss Ashworth," he said clearly, "in a room containing 4 investors and a senior solicitor. She has been managing the estate archive since her arrival. She identified the original discrepancy. She prepared the analysis." Silence. Mr. Whitmore looked at Penelope for a moment. She looked back. "She is the governess," Mr. Whitmore said. "She is the woman who found the fraud your firm's former employee committed," said Lucian. "The title is less relevant than the quality of the work." The partner to Mr. Whitmore's left, a younger man, Sir Thomas Holbrook, who had been paying attention in a different way than the others, looked at the 11 pages on the table. He looked at Penelope. He looked back at the pages. "The source notation is impeccable," Sir Thomas said, and it was not a compliment so much as an acknowledgement, the acknowledgement of someone who had just understood what he was looking at. The adjournment ended. The investment partners examined the source documents. Mr. Whitmore, after 40 minutes, withdrew the proposal for an appointed management representative. The partnership agreements were confirmed as currently valid and appropriately operative. After the partners left, Mr. Graves came to Penelope's chair and said, quietly, "Miss Ashworth, in 20 years of working with this estate, I have not seen that kind of analysis produced under those circumstances, or indeed under any circumstances. I hope the Duke appreciates what he has in this house." "He is beginning to," she said, which was the truest thing she had said in weeks. It was not a ballroom, and it was not a formal inquiry, but when Lucian turned to the room of investors and named her, something shifted that could not be shifted back. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing. 4 men in that drawing room had just understood that. As the investors' carriages departed down the gravel drive and the household released its held breath, Lucian appeared at the door of the archive room where Penelope had returned to put the source documents back in their proper order. He stood in the doorway in the same way he had stood there 43 mornings ago, except that now he was fully dressed, and it was afternoon, and they had spent 6 weeks becoming each other's necessary company without either of them naming it. "The eastern drainage," he said. "The surveyor I wrote to in Gloucester can begin in April," she said, "if you want to proceed with the rerouting." "I do." He came into the room. "I received a letter from the solicitor this afternoon regarding a new estate management engagement. He has proposed terms for a formal appointment, not estate manager, which is not quite the correct title, he says. but chief accounts advisor, with a specific mandate over the archive and the tenant accounts and the investment agreements. He set the letter on the desk beside her. The terms are his draft. I would like your revision before I execute it. And she looked at the letter. She looked at him. The terms are for me, she said. Yes. He stood with his hands at his sides and his composure entirely in place, and she understood, in that moment, that this was what courage looked like in him, not demonstrated by anything expansive, but by the fact that he was standing in a room asking a woman he had not officially offered a position to whether she would revise her own contract. She picked up the letter and read it through. She took her pen and made 4 small notations in the margin, one concerning the scope of authority over the investment agreements, one concerning the archive access provisions, one concerning the remuneration, which she amended upward by £30 annually, on the grounds that it was £30 short of accurate, and one concerning the title, which she crossed out and replaced with a single word she wrote in the margin. She handed it back. He read her revisions. He read the new title she had written. His face was still, but his eyes held something that was not quite amusement, and not quite warmth, but was shaped like both. Steward, he said, reading what she had written. It is the correct word, she said, Your Grace. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, with the quiet of someone who has made a decision and intends to hold it, Lucian. She said nothing. In this room, he said, when we are working, I would prefer. He stopped. He was not accustomed to the vocabulary of preference, she had noticed, the way some men are not accustomed to it, because they have spent so long in the vocabulary of position. I will consider it, she said. And then, because she was Penelope Ashworth, and she was not going to make it easy for him, Lucian. He executed the contract that evening. There was a dinner in the 2nd week of December, at which Lady Cecilia was present for the last time, though no one knew this at the time. It was a dinner that went well by all visible measures. The food was good, the conversation was managed. Clara performed at the piano with the slightly effortful precision of a child who has had 6 weeks of lessons and wants to demonstrate that they were not wasted. Lady Cecilia sat beside the Duke and was everything she was supposed to be. At the close of the dinner, when the guests had removed to the drawing room, Lucian went to the music room. Penelope found him there when she went to collect Clara's music book. He was standing at the manuscript on the wall, the one she had told him about, all 3 pages now, the 3rd retrieved from the solicitor's archive and framed beside the first 2. He heard her come in and did not turn. Would you play it? She sat at the piano. She had practiced the composition twice, alone, in the early mornings, working from the score. She played it through from the first page to the last, without speaking, and the room held it. When she finished, he turned from the wall. She would have liked you, he said. Penelope sat very still at the piano and did not allow herself to speak until she was sure of her voice. That is the kindest thing anyone has said to me in a very long time. He crossed the room. He stood beside the piano bench, and he was close enough now that she could see, in the candlelight, that the composure was not composure but something held with effort. Not grief, not any longer, but something that was the remainder of grief after it has been carried far enough to become part of the structure of a person. He said, I would like to ask you something. She looked up at him. It is a practical question, he said, which was how she knew it was not a practical question. The estate requires, that is, the title requires, and it is expected by the county, by the family. My uncle is arriving in January, and he will expect to find. He stopped. He began again. I am proposing a marriage, he said. I am aware that I am not proposing it well. You are proposing it precisely enough, she said. It would be strategically useful, he said, for the estate, and for the question of the title, and for... I understand the strategic logic, she said. It's the same logic that will explain it to your uncle in January. She looked at him steadily. I would like to think about it. He nodded. He had not expected an immediate answer, she could see that. He had the expression of someone who has offered a thing they value and understood, in offering it, that the offering is the thing that cost them. She thought about it for 3 days. She thought about it the way she thought about all things that mattered, carefully, in sequence. examining each part of the structure before committing to the whole. She thought about what it would cost her, and what it would give her, and what it would make of the life she had been building in the only way available to her, one careful horizontal gain at a time. On the third day, she went to the library in the evening, and she found him there. "I will not accept the proposal you made in the music room," she said. He looked up from his book. "The strategic one. The estate, and the title, and the January uncle." She came to the chair across from him and sat down. "If you want to ask me again, ask me the one you haven't said yet." He set his book down. He stood, which was not necessary, and then he did something she had not prepared for. He crossed the room and went down on one knee in front of her chair, which was the second time in his life she suspected he had knelt to anyone, and he said, "Not because it is convenient or appropriate or fitted the requirements my position imposes, but because you walked into my house with a trunk and a letter, and 6 weeks later you had found the fraud, rebuilt the archive, reconstructed the yield accounts, saved the investment agreements, and played my mother's music, because you correct what is wrong in front of you, without requiring anyone's permission. Because you have been the most competent person in every room you have occupied, and you have done it without asking for anything in return, and I would like you to ask for things. I would like to be the person you ask." He paused. That is a poor speech, but it is entirely true. Penelope considered it for a full minute. She thought about the Dorset Library, and the wool merchant, and Mr. Birch, and Mrs. Dunmore, and the 4 households, and the gray dress, and the 43 mornings at the archive desk, and the candle burned down to 2 inches, and the surveyor's report from 1791, and the manuscript score in 3 frames on the music room wall. She thought about what it had cost her to become what she was, and she thought about what it would cost her to be seen as what she was, and she decided that the second cost was one she was willing to pay. "Yes," she said. He rose. He took her hand, the first time, the only ungloved hand he had taken, and held it for a moment, and she felt the weight of his attention in it, and she did not look away. They were married in February, in the parish church adjacent to the estate, on a morning that was cold and clear, with the particular clarity of winter that makes everything sharp-edged and certain. Mrs. Finch wept with the contained dignity of a woman who considers herself professional, and cannot entirely manage it. Mr. Graves attended as a witness, and shook her hand afterward, in the manner of someone who has spent the last 3 months watching something he considers appropriate finally occur. Clara Vane, sitting in the front pew with her hair braided and her boots polished, reached over during the ceremony, and tucked her small hand inside Penelope's until the exchange of rings. There was a dinner that evening, and after it, when the house was quiet, Lucian stood in the doorway of the morning room, the room that had been his mother's, and watched Penelope at the writing desk with a letter to Anne in Bath. She knew he was watching. She finished the letter, folded it, and turned. "Your cravat has been crooked since before dinner," she said. He came across the room and stood in front of her, and let her straighten it. She did, with the brisk competence she brought to everything, and then her hands rested for a moment on his lapels before she stepped back. "Better," she said. "It has been crooked for much longer than that," he said. She understood what he meant. She thought perhaps it had been crooked since 1820, and she was not going to say so, and he was not going to say so, and they both understood it entirely. Lord Thomas Ashworth arrived in June, named for the Merivale family's older line, with his mother's precision about the eyes, and his father's particular stillness when he regarded a room, as though already assessing what it contained. Penelope delivered him early on a Tuesday morning, without requiring more of the household than was necessary, which was how she did most things. Lucian sat in the chair beside her afterward, and held his son for a long time without speaking. Clara, now 10, was permitted to hold him briefly in the afternoon, and she did so with the careful seriousness of a child who understands she has been given something fragile and important. Margaret came 3 years later, named for the grandmother she would never meet, a dark-haired, curious child who learned to walk at 10 months and spent her second year following Penelope through the estate archive with the particular attention of a child in the presence of something she has decided to understand. The eastern boundary farms were rerouted in the spring of 1823, 3 years after the work began, and the yield differential that had persisted for a decade resolved itself over the following 2 harvests into parity with the western farms. The surveyor wrote to say that the soil composition was more favorable than he had expected, and the margin recovery would likely exceed Penelope's original projection. She wrote back with a revised 5-year estimate, which turned out to be accurate to within 6 pounds. The estate accounts she maintained during those years were organized in a particular way. Not merely the operational records, but a complete working archive with annotated explanations of every decision, its rationale, and its outcome. When the neighboring estate at Caldwell Park engaged a new solicitor who found their records in disarray, it was Lucian who suggested they contact Merivale's steward for guidance. 3 other estates in the county followed within 2 years. Penelope's annotated methodology became, in the quiet way of useful things, a template. On an evening in November of 1824, with Thomas nearly 3, and Margaret not yet 1, and the house settled into its particular winter rhythm, Lucian came to the library at 9 o'clock, and found Penelope at the desk with the county correspondence spread before her. He stood in the doorway in the same way he had stood there on so many evenings, and she knew he was there before he spoke because she knew his footfall, the way she knew everything she had paid careful enough attention to. "Thomas has escaped the crib again," he said. She set down her pen. "Which corridor did you find him in?" "The music room." She rose and went with him, and they found Thomas sitting in front of the closed piano, with his hands placed on the keys, in the exact attitude of someone waiting to be taught, his bare feet on the cold floor, entirely unconcerned with the hour. Lucian picked him up. Thomas tucked his head under his father's chin with the absolute confidence of a child who has never had reason to doubt he will be held, and regarded Penelope with the specific evaluating attention he had inherited from both of them. Penelope looked at her son in his father's arms, in the room his grandmother had built for herself, with the 3 pages of manuscript score framed on the wall above the piano, and she felt the weight of everything that had been built, and everything that had been saved, and everything that had simply, at some point, become ordinary in the way that a life you have made becomes ordinary. Not small, not less, but yours, held up by the actual structure of things rather than the appearance of it. She straightened Thomas's collar, because it was turned up on one side. Lucian watched her do it with the particular quiet attention he brought to all the things he intended to remember. She looked up and found him watching and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying that the room wasn't already holding. He was watching her. She knew he was watching. The library would be cold in another hour, and Thomas would need to be returned to his crib, and the county correspondence would wait until morning, and the morning would bring its list, and she would bring everything she had to it, the way she always had, and put it to work.